From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. On Tuesday evening, a deadly conflict in the Middle East escalated even further. Sirens sounded across central parts of Israel, including Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, as around 180 Iranian missiles were fired at Israel. Most were intercepted, Israel say.
Tonight, Iran again attacked Israel with hundreds of missiles. This attack failed.
The attacks followed a ground invasion of Lebanon by Israel, targeting the militant group Hezbollah's infrastructure. Iran has now intervened. But what next for a nervous region hoping for a cooling off, but fearing an escalation?
Iran made a great mistake last night, and it will pay for it.
Make no mistake, the United States is fully supportive of Israel.
We stand with Israel, and we recognize her right to self-defense in the face of this aggression. Iran must stop these attacks.
The Story today. Iran and Israel at war.
Hello, my name is George Grylls. I'm defence correspondent for The Times.
Tuesday evening, explain for us what happened. When did you sort of first get wind that something was afoot from Iran?
So on Tuesday afternoon, the US said that Israel should brace for an imminent ballistic missile attack from Iran.
That breaking news, the U.S. saying that Iran is preparing to attack Israel with ballistic missiles.
They say we are actively supporting defensive preparations to defend Israel against this attack, a direct military attack from Iran against Israel.
They said to their embassy staff in Jerusalem to immediately seek shelter. The Israeli military came out with a statement, basically a matter of minutes later, saying everyone seek shelter as well. And at that point, we knew that Iran was firing ballistic missiles. We didn't know how many at that stage at Israel.
And people who live in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem especially have measures in place for dealing with this kind of things. I mean, lots of people have safe rooms, don't they, that they go to in their buildings or in their homes?
Yeah, there are bunkers throughout Israel. There are safe rooms. People, whenever an alarm or a siren goes off in Israel, people know what to do and they sprint basically for cover. And depending on how far away you are from the threat, you might react more quickly. So, for example, if you lived in communities around Gaza or if you lived on the border with Lebanon and there's an alarm for a rocket attack, then you have only a matter of seconds to get to the shelter. If you live in Tel Aviv, it's a bit longer. A ballistic missile from Iran takes about 12 minutes to get to Israel. So that's how long they had to get. But if you looked at the kind of footage that was circulated on social media, you would see empty streets in Jerusalem. People who might have been driving home, commuting, have to park their cars by the side of the road. And if they can't get into shelter, you lie flat on the floor or you get in the nearest ditch, really.
We also saw from lots of that social media footage as well, a sort of sprinkling of little fires and explosions in the sky as Israel's aerial defences stopped a lot of these missiles. That's something, again, which is well practiced and it seems very effective.
Yeah, they probably have the most advanced air defence system coverage anywhere in the world. I mean, they've got 3 different layers. They've got Iron Dome, which is mainly used for short-range, unsophisticated rockets. It could also deal with artillery and drones. That's the one that people are probably most familiar with. But they also have David Sling, which is kind of medium range, can do cruise missiles. And then they have also Arrow. And Arrow is their long-range air defence, and that can shoot down ballistic missiles. And even Arrow 3, which is their latest version of Arrow, that can shoot down ballistic missiles in space. The difference between a ballistic missile and a cruise missile, a ballistic missile goes in a kind of parabola, a big arc. Imagine it kind of gets fired up in the air. Well, it will leave the Earth's atmosphere and then come back down again, whereas a cruise missile kind of goes straight basically towards its target and is a bit slower.
Yes, and the impact of the missile strikes, first of all, seems to be very little. I mean, one person lost their life, is that right? And then a few injured.
It seemed like the shrapnel, the debris from an interception over the West Bank killed someone. Otherwise, people were able to kind of get to the shelters in time. So mostly Israeli air defences work. That said, it's not entirely clear. I mean, the Israelis are playing down that there's been any damage, but it seems like the Iranians were targeting Israeli airfields. So we saw kind of footage of Nevatim, which is a big air base, coming under a lot of attack. So it's not entirely clear the damage that has been done there because the Israelis don't really want to disclose, but they're saying it hasn't affected their operations and are playing it down.
There was a greater loss of life, though, from a shooting which happened. Well, reports of it came out just before the missiles started to come into Israeli air defences, and that was a shooting in a sort of part of Tel Aviv.
It coincided almost with the alarms and people kind of seeking shelter. That was in Jaffa, so Jaffa and Tel Aviv are basically contiguous. And two gunmen, well actually one gunman and a knifeman, started randomly attacking passers-by, commuters on a tram, and then they got off the tram and continued their assault. I think the latest death toll at the moment is 7. It might climb. There are lots of people who are still in a serious condition in hospital. But Israel had been bracing for these sorts of terror attacks, to be honest, for a number of weeks, and it's not entirely clear whether or not these Palestinian militants, they were from Hebron, which is in the south of the West Bank, if they had basically seized the opportunity to kind of get involved, or if this had been a premeditated attack.
So we've got that kind of a threat for Israel. We've also got, of course, the threat we mentioned moments ago of these ballistic missiles and the rest coming from Iran. And this latest escalation started back when we had that quite audacious attack on Hezbollah by Israel with the pagers and the walkie-talkies exploding and the rest a couple of weeks or so ago, getting to the point actually where they were able to kill the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah.
Yeah, it was an astonishing hour, really, where Netanyahu flew to the UN. He gave this speech in which he denounced the UN. He called it a house of darkness. He accused it of anti-Semitism for not standing with Israel since October the 7th.
The singling out of the one and only Jewish state continues to be a moral stain on the United Nations. It has made this once respected institution contemptible in the eyes of decent people everywhere. But for the Palestinians, this UN House of Darkness is home court. They know that in this swamp of anti-Semitic bile, there's an automatic majority willing to demonize the Jewish state on anything.
And then moments later, we heard of a huge airstrike, larger even than the ones of the days preceding that one, in Dahya, which is the southern suburb of Beirut, which is the kind of Hezbollah stronghold.
Moments ago, the Israel Defense Forces carried out a precise strike on the central headquarters of the Hezbollah terror organization that served as the epicenter of Hezbollah's terror.
This airstrike was of a different magnitude to the ones that had preceded it. Israel straight away claimed that this was Hezbollah's headquarters that they'd struck, and straight away questions start to be asked, what has happened to Hassan Nasrallah, who is the head of Hezbollah? Now, bear in mind, this is the war that Israel wanted. They did not want a war with Hamas. So Hamas was regarded as a minor threat compared to Hezbollah before October the 7th last year. And if you think about the geography of Gaza, that helps you understand why Hezbollah was regarded as more as a threat, because Gaza is basically surrounded by Israel. It's a tiny pocket of land, and they couldn't be built up into this huge militia that would really challenge Israel. That was the thinking, at least. Whereas Hezbollah, in southern Lebanon, there's a border with Syria. It's quite easy for the Iranians to smuggle arms there. And since 2006, which is the last time the Israelis launched an invasion of Lebanon, Hezbollah had grown in its strength by quite a lot. So they commanded an arsenal of, by some estimates, about 150,000 missiles and rockets rockets and guided missiles as opposed to rockets made out of drain pipes that Hamas were firing. And they also had 45,000 fighters, by some estimates. A lot of them were battle-hardened. They had fought with Assad in Syria. So this was a much bigger, more trained organization that Israel thought posed a greater threat, and more than that, was seen as the keystone of Iran's axis of resistance across the Middle East.
And taking all of that then, it must have been a lot more difficult to infiltrate it in an intelligence way, to even make things like the killing of Nasrallah possible. How long had all of that been in the works, and was that the result of just a few weeks of frustration? Did this go back to October the 8th when Hezbollah started firing rockets at Israel, or did it maybe even go further back from that?
Judging by what has happened since then and the way in which they have decapitated Hezbollah with ruthless efficiency over a couple of weeks, clearly they had totally penetrated Hezbollah's top leadership, and they had spent many years doing this. One imagines through a combination of signals, intelligence, intercepting calls. In fact, we know they definitely were doing that because Nasrallah was so worried about Hezbollah using mobile phones that he bulk ordered all these pages that the Israelis then intercepted and turned into booby traps and turned into exploding bombs. So they had clearly spent a long time studying and understanding Hezbollah in a way that perhaps they had not done with Hamas because they regarded them as a lesser threat.
Over the weekend, we had then Israeli troops amassing on the border in readiness. You were there as that was happening. What did it look like? What did you see?
So we had spent some days driving around trying to find, you can't hide an army. If you're going to launch an innovation, it's obvious. I was there after October the 7th. I saw the parking lots north of Gaza of all the tanks lined up. And for a while, it was hard to find where the Israeli army was. And that wasn't for lack of trying. I drove all around the north in those days preceding it. And then suddenly, in about a 24-hour period over Saturday or Sunday, you saw this agglomeration of tanks, armoured vehicles, all the kind of support maintenance vehicles. And I saw the tank chains being laid out so that they were fitting the tanks to get them ready. All the last-minute preparation, soldiers with wrenches. You saw reservists hopping off coaches coming up from central Israel because buses were put on. You saw, reservists enjoying a last takeaway meal at all those petrol stations near the border. It felt very much like this was imminent, and that was on Sunday evening when you saw they're going in the next 24 hours, and so it proved.
Monday night then was when we had the news going into Tuesday morning that actually there had been a ground incursion of those troops that you saw amassing there on the border, the first to make that kind of incursion for 2 decades or so, isn't it? Described as limited, localised and targeted.
These localized ground raids will target Hezbollah strongholds that threaten Israeli towns, kibbutzim and communities along our border.
What exactly happened?
Well, this was the one that they announced. Actually, it transpired they had been conducting special operations for almost a year. They had spent 200 nights over the border discovering tunnels. Hezbollah has an extensive tunnel network. It seems most analysts kind of agree it's even more extensive than the one underneath Gaza, which some have said is 300 miles long. So this is a serious kind of threat to them. And particularly they were trying to look at those tunnels that were right next to the border that Hezbollah could use to infiltrate underneath the border, tunnel underneath the border.
So lots of us have been getting agitated about when might Israel move troops over the border into Lebanon, south of Lebanon. And it's already been happening.
It's already been happening. This was the moment they declared it. I mean, and also there's a difference between limited raids at night, special operations. I mean, to be fair, they'd been spending apparently as long as 4 days consecutively over the border in Lebanon. So they've been pretty comprehensive raids, but there is difference still between that and deploying heavy artillery and tanks and all the rest of it and bringing all that force to bear, which is what happened on Monday night and when they stepped up their operations, put it that way, in Lebanon.
And they released lots of video footage that they say were from within these Hezbollah tunnels, and they had on display lots of weapons that they said that they had found. What was the logic in them actually going and taking these weapons and exposing these tunnels and maybe destroying them? Why were they doing that now?
It's not the first time they have done this. So I think there are different types of tunnels as well. So there are the tunnels right next to the border, and they are the size of they're maybe 2 meters tall, they're very narrow, they're kind of dingy, and those are the ones that Israel fears Hezbollah would use to launch an October the 7th style attack. And they said there were plans for 3,000 militants to use those tunnels to go under the border and basically carry out a similar massacre to what happened on October the 7th. That's the direct threat. But then further back, and Hezbollah has released these videos of their capabilities, they look like these huge bond layers, these cavernous tunnels, which are not like those small confined ones near the border where you're basically trying to kind of get through without being noticed. This is where Hezbollah has kind of built an underground network to supply themselves in the event of war, and even to the extent they have special camouflaged openings so that a lorry can drive underneath through a tunnel with rocket launchers on the back. The doors open up at the top and it can fire directly without being seen by Israeli reconnaissance drones from the underground tunnels. Then the doors close back up and it goes away again.
And that's a problem for Israel because over the border in northern Israel, they've had to clear out lots of civilians who were at risk of being hit by something being fired from those tunnels.
At the moment, it doesn't seem like they're going after that bigger network further back, just for the reason that it is impossible to know. But according to kind of various studies, that network could extend as far back as Beirut. So at the moment, they're concentrating on those smaller ones from which Hezbollah could launch Hamas-style, October the 7th style raids. And so that's primarily what they were doing with those special operations.
George, we're recording this on Wednesday. This is the sort of day after that enormous barrage of missiles sent from Iran to Israel, as we were discussing earlier. Mostly intercepted. The damage and death and injury doesn't seem to be that much as things stand. We have sort of been here before, haven't we? In April, Iran firing lots of missiles at Israel intercepting them.
Iran launched an unprecedented attack on Israel. It involves dozens of drones launched from Iranian territory. A first. This is in retaliation for Israel's bombing of Iran's consulate in Syria earlier this month.
Is this the same happening again?
No, because that was choreographed to an extent. The Iranians had made clear through back channels, so through intermediaries, to the Americans that this was happening. The Americans had time to position their assets, aircraft, air defense, ready their troops who are at small bases in Iraq, for example. They were bracing for this attack to the extent the RAF was able to be involved in shooting down drones, and the French were there, and Jordanian airspace was all cleared for them to operate on. So perhaps one or two crossed into Israeli territory, but most of them were actually shot down further away. And that was a barrage of 300 ballistic missiles, cruise missiles and drones. But it was primarily the kind of cruise missiles and drones. There were some ballistic missiles as well, but effectively it wasn't some sort of surprise attack. This time they were going to kill. They fired 181 ballistic missiles at Israel, basically simultaneously, challenging Israeli air defenses as much as they could and not warning the Americans, seemingly.
How do we think Israel will respond to this now?
Well, they've already said they're vowing to seek revenge for this, that it won't go unpunished.
Whoever attacks us, we attack him. This is true wherever we fight the axis of evil.
It's worth going back again to that UN speech that Netanyahu gave at the beginning, moments before they assassinated Nasrallah, where he said,
"There is no place in Iran that the long arm of Israel cannot reach. And that's true of the entire Middle East."
In my message to the tyrants of Tehran, don't you dare. And the question is the extent of the retaliatory strikes, whether the US will be involved, which they haven't yet, in terms of actually attacking Iran. It's not clear. You would imagine they're still trying to de-escalate as much as they can. But I think it would stretch credulity to think that the Israelis would not seek some sort of revenge.
Because again, after what happened in April, they had a single or at least a limited strike on a sort of military target within Iran, I guess sort of proof of concept that they can hit Iran. So you're saying this time around, as a minimum, we think there probably will be some kind of airstrike on Iranian territory.
It was almost demonstrative to the Iranians, that attack, because it was saying, I don't think it did much damage, but it was saying, we can get you, we can strike anywhere. And they've already proved this as well by assassinating Ismail Haniyeh, who was the head of Hamas when he was attending the inauguration of the new Iranian president. So they have shown the long arm of Israel does reach across the Middle East. The question is now, what is the scale of their retaliation?
Will they be, we think, looking to do harm to Iranian civilians? Is there anything in particular that we think they might want to target or destroy in Iran? I mean, I'm just trying to get a sense of how far they can go.
The long-term goal has been to flatten their nuclear enterprise and to make sure that there is no possibility of Iran ever getting a nuclear weapon. But to do that, I think it's kind of widely accepted they would need US backing and potentially even US help. So that might be what they would ideally use this as a justification to go after. But that would be a pretty big step. So let's see what the coming, well, not even days, but hours bring.
Yes. And on the US point, why do you think there's still a question mark about how involved they might be? I mean, what have you read into what they've said so far?
Firstly, the US is kind of heading for an election period, so they've got their own stuff going on. Let's not forget that. There was an incredible moment from Jake Sullivan, who's the National Security Advisor, before October the 7th, where he said the Middle East has been fairly quiet for a while. I can't remember what the exact quote is, but they were saying we can turn our attention to China, we can deal with Ukraine. The Middle East, that was that period with Iraq and Afghanistan and all the rest of it, but it's gone off the boil, and so we don't need to worry about that. And now there's a lingering sense of that's ideally what they would like to do. So if they could keep a lid on this, that would be ideal. Otherwise, they're dealing with Russia and Ukraine. They're trying to deter China and Taiwan. I mean, it's a huge amount.
But there are gradations of support, aren't they? And, Joe Biden said after this missile attack on Tuesday evening that, quote, make no mistake, the United States is fully, fully, fully supportive of Israel. But there's still a spectrum there of actually helping them with weapons and firing stuff of their own to supplying intelligence and maybe telling the Israelis where they might hit.
And also the Americans are not averse to themselves carrying out assassinations against Iranian figures. So Qasem Soleimani in 2020, I think it was, who they took out in a drone strike. So if there are senior commanders who they feel are kind of pushing for more aggression against Israel, who knows? Who knows where the Biden administration would go on this? Remember, that was the Trump administration that sanctioned that strike.
And if we've got, so a question mark over the United States, on the Iranian side of things, they have said if Israel retaliates, there's basically more where this came from. The received wisdom has always been that Iran does not want to get into a wider conflict. They're not in a situation or a state to actually deal with that. You read those quite bellicose statements from them, though. I don't know. At least I've started to feel a bit unsure about it.
It's said from a position of weakness, I think. Bear in mind, their main leverage they had over Israel was Hezbollah. Hezbollah was the jewel in the crown of the axis of resistance across the Middle East. This was the force that they had built up that they thought could kind of hold some cards in any war, that they could say to Israel, if you dare to come after us, we've got this group with 150,000 rockets and missiles on your border, 45,000 troops, and we can press that button at any time. And that has come crashing down. So suddenly the main threat, the main deterrence that Iran thought it had built up has gone. And so I think these attacks and these statements are ultimately coming from a position of weakness.
And we can speculate about what Iran might do. We can speculate about what the United States would do. But actually, at time of recording, the question is, what is Benjamin Netanyahu going to decide to do? And thinking about his current position, finally, and how that has changed throughout the course of this almost year of war, is he in a different place? Do you think he is more predisposed to escalation and trying to get this done in quite a dramatic way?
Again, we've got to think about the psychology of Netanyahu and how he views his own role in history, and an ultimate goal for him would be destroying Iranian influence across the Middle East and putting back their nuclear program to nothing. I'm sure he would be lobbying the US and trying to get permission, but I think they would struggle to do that without some sort of US permission if they were going to do that level of response. And there will surely be some dialogue between the scenes. Right now, there'll be haggling and negotiation over what sort of response Israel should carry out against Iran.
George Grylls, defence correspondent for The Times. There is plenty more from George and his colleagues in the region at thetimes.com. If you've got a subscription, you can read about George's recent reporting trip from within Israel, including at that tense northern border with Lebanon. You can also listen to the latest coverage live and for free on Times Radio. And if you enjoyed this episode, why not share it with a friend who you think might also find it interesting? Send them a link. The producer today was Priyanka Deladia, the executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition was by Mauro Seto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.